afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another session of Career Talks. I'm Orlando Haynes, and this is a Sykes production. Super excited. I say that every time because I am just having the opportunity to do LinkedIn Lives and talk to so many interesting people. It is absolutely a blessing and a privilege. So I'm excited about our next guest. Her name is Nicole Dessain. She's the Chief Employee Experience Officer at an organization called Talent Imperative. And what she focuses on is this theory and methodology around design thinking, which I came across one of her YouTubes presentations and immediately was intrigued to understand this whole concept of what design thinking does. So their focus is, her focus is really assisting with the HR practitioners in how to implement this design thinking. So I'm super excited to bring her on and have her share this content with us. Please, as you're chiming in, also share where you're coming from and have questions ready, because this is going to be a very insightful discussion here. So without further ado, let's bring on Miss Nicole Dessain. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody.
Good. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. You are coming in from Chicago. And you said you were saying something about the weather there earlier.
Yeah, Indian summer. So we're enjoying Indian summer before winter is coming.
Awesome. So as folks come in, they please definitely share where you're coming from and or where you're chiming in from, and then also prepare your questions as we dive in. So before we dive into the questions, if you want to share a little bit more about your experience, where you work at, some of the projects you've done, this way they get a better understanding of your expertise.
Yeah. So first, as you hear me open my mouth, I'm not originally from Chicago. I was born and raised in Germany, so I'm an immigrant to the United States. My career started in human resources, like many of yours probably. I was an expat for 6 years and then moved to the dark side to management consulting. I worked as an executive at Accenture for 4.5 years and then moved back internally, where I built a talent strategy COE and then started my business about 6 years ago, Talent Imperative, talent management consultancy. And then about 5 years ago, I discovered design thinking on a talent acquisition strategy project with a client. And I was blown away by its potential for human resources. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about it. And then started to become a student. So I studied with IDEO, Luma Institute, and then started to integrate it into my services, and especially in the employee experience design space, because that's a great application of design thinking in HR. And now I also lecture at Northwestern University as well, where we bring design thinking to org design challenges. So that's a little bit about myself. And my creative superpower as design thinkers, we always share that. My creative superpower is connecting the dots.
Awesome.
What's yours?
I love it. Great question. Yeah. So, I'll answer that, and I'm going to pose it to the folks that are chiming in. So yeah. I believe my superpower is definitely the power of collaboration and bringing folks together. So I love that idea. So let me just welcome some folks. And we have Brian Cope chiming in from Claremont. Roseanne Gutman, thank you for joining. Jessica, thank you for joining. Gwen, Bill, how's it going, Bill? And someone, your profile is not coming in, but it's from Tampa, so we appreciate you chiming in as well. So also share what your superpower is. So that question is now posed to the viewers, and we'll pop up a few there. So design thinking, just in this normal term, is very intriguing, right? It forces you to think, what is design thinking? So that will be the first question. Talk to us about what is design thinking and how that method came about.
Yeah, sure. So in short, design thinking is a method and a mindset. That's important, not just a toolbox, but a mindset for complex problem solving. And when we think about human resources, we have a lot of complex people challenges, right? So it's a great application in that area. And the history of it, it's been used since the 90s. Initially you might know about it from product design, then sort of app design or, user interface design. And so the latest application is in service and experience design. So for example, patient experience in a hospital setting. And the last frontier, I like to call it, is in employee experience or in the HR space, really. So whenever you have an end user or a customer in essence, and yes, I think our employees, our leaders are our customers, right? So whenever you have that, you want to center that group or that person and create a solution around them, for them, and with them. And that's the key. So it's a method that's based on empathy, it's based on co-creation, it's based on iteration.
Okay. So now, with that, I like that breakdown of empathy and iteration. So, what drove you to start an organization centered around design thinking and pushing it to because you said you found out about it in the talent acquisition project.
Mm-hmm.
So, what drove you first? What drove you to start a business around this, and then two, how do you see it impacting HR community and how they can implement it? What does that look like? What does that?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to start by pointing on my T-shirt, which says, "Let's bring the human back to human resources." And that's literally, and whenever I say that to HR people, they know what that means, and I see their eyes light up. Because if you think back, why did you get into the function in the first place? It was probably because you wanted to help people. You wanted to, right? You wanted to make sure people are motivated and engaged at work. But then we know for so many reasons, other things can come in between. And it's interesting because I actually lectured at DePaul University earlier this year, and I asked the students why they thought, HR maybe is currently not as human-centered as it could be. And they came out with 3 P's: profit, policy, and process. And I thought that was kind of ingenious. And I think that's what it is, right? Sometimes we really, the employee gets lost in what we do because of these 3 P's, right? So I think it's really time that we bring the human back to human resources, especially in an environment where everything has become more experience centered. As a customer, we expect to have an experience, but yet then we go to work and often it's not an experience, right? So if we think more about work as an experience and really think that through and how we can become a servant of that as HR professionals, I think ultimately not only are we going to make work better for our employees and our leaders, I think we're going to have more fun at work as well. Why shouldn't we, right? So so that's the reason. And so I really went on this mission to bring design thinking to human resources. So through my services at Talent Imperative, and then a little over a year ago, I founded the HR Hackathon Alliance, which is literally a community. We are in 5 cities right now in the US and growing globally, of bringing sort of a 2-hour design thinking format to the local HR community where HR can experiment with the method, have fun with it and learn it, and then bring it back to their organization. So that's sort of my mission, to bring the method to HR and the mindset so it can become a true superpower for us. So we can really be, we can change the world. Honestly, I believe HR has such a power to change the world. People are at work, 80%, 90% of their day. And it's such an awesome, I don't want to say obligation, but an awesome way to spend our work life to make sure that happens, I think.
That makes sense. So now can design thinking become the culture of a company? And if so, how does HR lead that charge? Who are their stakeholders and partners they need to bring together? So it's not just regulated with HR, but spearheaded with HR, and it starts to kind of consume an organization, if that's even possible, it kind of intertwined with your mission, if that question makes sense there.
That makes a lot of sense. And sometimes design thinking is also called human-centered design. And I think, and that goes back to that mindset. So I think creating values and behaviors of everything we do, if we think about the customer, if we think about employees, if we think about any other stakeholders, to have this truly human-centered lens, that's really the key. But to your point, how do you bring it to the organization? So I actually have my own podcast. It's called Talent, where I interview HR leaders who have brought design thinking to the organization. And that's sort of one of the questions I ask all of them. And so the theme that I've heard from them is don't necessarily bring it in as, okay, we're going to do this big new thing. It's called design thinking. It's going to change the world and it's going to change you, right? So that, and we know from a change management perspective, that usually doesn't work well anyways, right? Mm-hmm. So what people have really found successful is they've started sort of just doing things with design thinking, right? So either ideating or maybe prototyping something or researching something, but they didn't necessarily call it that. They just said, hey, you have this challenge, let me try this. And what happened then, people got really excited because it just works. And then they spread the word, and then they come back and say, hey, you did this thing the other day, can you do this again? And then it sort of permeates through the organization. So that's been really successful for many. And I always say in HR anyways, sometimes it's really about the packaging, right? You don't need to call it something or make it a big deal. Just do it and then call it whatever makes sense in that context in the organization. The other thing is how you might also start or bring it in is by finding champions in the business who already use design thinking. So for example, in marketing, software design, IT, they know the method already and they know it works, right? So you could find an executive sort of who was bought in the method but has not thought about using it for talent or for employee experience. But they're usually really easy to sell to because they know it works. And then you say, hey, have you thought about using it for, the talent challenge you're trying to tackle? Why don't we try this? And usually it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then if one executive starts it, others become curious and so forth. So those are two, methods that I hear from the people I interview that work really well in bringing it to the organization.
Okay. So two questions from that that I want to unpack there is one, because you said champions. So just like diversity and inclusion, they've had diversity champions, for the organization who kind of leads that charge. Can design thinking, even labeling it, keeping it with that label so everyone kind of knows what it is, can there, or based on what your knowledge, can companies or should companies kind of create a design thinking champion to now start saying, okay, let's start to train and understand what design thinking is, and being able to, start again, not to overplay the word thinking, but thinking more strategically to be able to solve these more high complex situations depending on the department. And I know it's not, again, just settles with HR. It can be in any department, every department, because you want the whole company to be forward thinking and problem solving. But is that one thing that is a good way to start? Kind of say, okay, let's start building out this community. Once we understand it, let's get a few champions who can now be the point of contact in organizing smaller groups within the organization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question. And I think that's a good, definitely a good way to start. And the beauty of this is too that HR doesn't need to be necessarily the owner or the sole, conductor or implementer of this method. That's what's great about it, and that's why also small HR organizations love it, because in essence, your employees and your leaders become your extended HR team. Because it is community based, it is co-creation based. So I love the idea of the champions. But also, as we know, you use the comparison to diversity. I don't think it can stop there. I think it's great to get things started, but ultimately it shouldn't be one person's job to be responsible for diversity or to be responsible for design thinking, right? I think ultimately we need to find a way to bring it into the organization So there is a mindset shift that happens and a behavior shift that happens across the organization, and everybody becomes design thinking champions.
Got it. Got it. Which probably leads to my next question, which you're probably already answering it. So, is design thinking a blueprint that can be passed on, or is it an action and a repetitive action in the way we just do things? Because you said earlier, just do it, right? So, if you start doing things, if someone says, hey, you just executed on this project, can you do that again? So, is there a blueprint that we can go with a manual and say, okay, here's a better understanding of what it is, or it's just a matter of watch us work and follow this pattern?
Yeah, so both. So ideally you want people, it's a method that's really best experienced through doing. It's really, I mean, you can present and you can train on it, but it's really not as powerful and impactful than if you at least build activities in where people sort of get their hands dirty and experience it. In my experience, it's the most powerful way of how people learn. But for sure, I mean, there's training out there. It certainly helps to give people maybe a basic framework or understanding of it. But ultimately, again, it's also, you said, is it a blueprint and a toolkit? Yes, there's so much out there, and there is. In the end, it's about applying it and building the muscle. I like to call it the muscle. And that's what, and I always say it starts with you. So when people ask me, how do I get started? So start with yourself. What are some things in the design thinking method, for example, that are your strength, and what do you have more difficulties with? So for example, for me, what doesn't come as easy or naturally is storytelling. It's a design thinking method. As a German, we're not naturally born storytellers, so I very consciously hone that skill. And then secondly, visualization. So drawing, to get your ideas across. Also, I'm not an artist or designer, not very creative, I think, but you don't have to be. Stick figures are enough. So those are two things that I try to practice. So I try to tell stories whenever I engage. When I take notes, I try to doodle a little bit to just remind myself. So it's like daily things I do. And then the next step is, how can you bring some of these things to your team? So for example, at your next team meeting, how can you hold a little ideation session with Post-its or electronic Post-its nowadays, right? And infuse that. And then the third step is, how can you bring it to projects, HR-related projects, or to your organization? So it's sort of, I think, a three-step process, because it's building your own skills, building skills of others, and then scaling it.
Now, are there different levels to design thinking based on the problem you're trying to solve? Like, do you scale up in design thinking because it's a higher level degree of problem, or what does that look like?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's a great question. And not every problem needs to be solved with design thinking too. So, if there's a, very simple thing, we need to plan an event for next week, you don't need to apply design thinking to that, for example, right? So, and it really depends on the project. You might not need to go through all the stages of the design thinking process. So the three key stages are discovery. That's where you do a lot of qualitative research, ethnographic research, interviews, observations, to really understand the problem very well. We usually skip that step and we jump right to ideation, which is only the second step. And then the last step is prototyping and testing. So you might not need to go through the entire steps depending on the project. There's also tools associated with each of these steps. You will not use all the tools all the time. You might just use one tool per phase. So for example, in employee experience design projects, let's say onboarding experience. In the discovery phase, I like to use what's called an employee experience journey map to understand the journey of a new hire. We map that, we identify pain points, opportunities, and then we move to ideation and then to prototyping. So it really depends on what you're trying to solve for, what you're going to pull out of your toolbox.
That's good. So now, are you doing that over the candidate experience? Are you doing that over a 30, 60, 90-day timeline? What are you seeing that's most effective so you can collect a the most amount of data to sort of tweak it if need be?
Yeah, so I always say so design thinking is a qualitative research method, and I always say to complement that with quantitative data, right? So for sure, if you're looking at the candidate experience, look at ATS data, look at satisfaction survey data. And I always, especially for candidate experience, I always say look at candidates who accepted, candidates who declined, candidates who you accepted, and candidates who you declined, right? To really get a full circle sort of feedback on all aspects of your candidate experience. So those are some of the data points that you want to add to some of the qualitative data you might use for design thinking.
I love that, yeah, especially being in talent acquisition. That's crucial, so you can start to pick out patterns, and see this way it can kind of attract a better talent, a better quality of talent, which can obviously help with retention, etc. So I'm seeing that long term process there. So let me ask you this: how can design thinking basically be used to design equity? That's very interesting there. How can that be done?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, one of the key parts of design thinking is empathy. Really trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the user we're solving for, and then the co-creation part. I think those areas especially lend themselves to the DEI space. And I always, like to quote Maya Angelou, where she said, "I think everybody has empathy. We might not have the courage to display it." And I find that a very interesting quote. And especially, I think sometimes in HR, you know, it's sometimes hard for us to be courageous for, again, so many reasons that we talked about before. But I think especially this topic, racism in the workplace and designing for equity requires us to become more courageous and more empathy driven. And so one of the recent initiatives actually that I launched with the HR Hackathon Alliance is hashtag HR versus racism. And you can follow us there and check us out there. We started launching a website in August with initially resources. So resources for self-education around white dominant culture, building anti-racist skills, and designing for equity, but also sharing social enterprises who address inequities in the workforce, Black HR consultants that you can hire to expand your own team, because let's face it, most of our HR teams are 90% female, middle-aged females like me, and we might not be as diverse as we should be, right? So how can you supplement your team? Of course, hiring, but then also in the interim through Black consultants. So that was the first step, to launch that sort of resource site. And now we're in the process to really thoughtfully thinking through what might be additional programming that we can offer specifically for our HR professionals to enable them to A, become more self-aware, B, build anti-racist skills in their organizations, and then C, to action, meaning to designing for equity. So that's what we're currently working on. And we're using, again, this design thinking lens to design the program, to iterate, to bring people in to co-create with us. So if you talk to me in 3 months, I can tell you more about where we're at with that. But so that's sort of our thinking and my thinking around it. I feel like we have an obligation. We have this platform, the HR Hackathon Alliance, and we need to use it for that purpose.
Got it. So, interesting point you made, and so I'll try to summarize it and let me know if I'm off topic or on topic there. So, just by having a diverse workforce in an organization, would you say by default that brings design thinking to the table for an organization and culture? So, and the reverse would be true if without it, does that limit or hurt the opportunity to have more of a design thinking culture in the organization?
Yeah, for sure. And there's been, studies, not that we should need studies for that, but yeah, the more diverse from all kinds of perspectives, right? But especially also racial diversity, of course. Our organizations are, the better they can design for their end users, be it the customers, right? Because whom are you designing your products or your services for, and who buys them? It's a much more diverse population than maybe is inside your organization. So there's a mismatch there. Same, if your HR team is sort of very homogenic and your workforce is more diverse, again, there's a mismatch there, right? So you want to, for sure, take a good look at who are the designers. And there's a great book that's also on our website that I'm reading right now as well. It's called Design Justice. And that sort of takes apart a little bit the historic design thinking process, in that sometimes designers tend to be very non-diverse. And so when you have non-diverse designers, the outcome or the impact may not be what you intended. And then it's really not, helpful, or not, user-friendly, or not really hitting the mark. So it really depends on who designs. Is that team diverse? And then also bringing in the people you design for, and also giving them credit, involving them, things like that. Similar to the discussion I think we're having around ERGs right now, right? Should people who work on ERGs be paid or not, right? How do we make sure they're treated fairly and compensated fairly, and things like that? So it's a little bit around that. Who is designing, and whom are we designing for, and are we really bringing them in the process to design for impact? And I find that very powerful from that book. Sometimes there's a good intent, but does it result in the impact, or does it result in a adverse impact? I find that very, very powerful sort of thing to think through, also from an HR perspective.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting that you said earlier too that sometimes the folks who are doing the designing are not diverse, but their end user is diverse. And so when they miss the mark, there seems to be this conundrum of why, what are we missing? Well, you're missing diverse thinkers on your team, right? That can help you uncover some of the cultural differences that'll meet the end user. So that's funny. And I wonder if, even though this, like you said, with this big social unrest, it's this big social push now to add more diverse folks to the organization from the top down. And there are some folks out there who will plainly say it: don't just hire an African American to fill a slot, but make sure it's a real hire. It's not just the quote unquote diverse hire to meet a quota. So I know that's being pushed a lot, and it's being watched very closely from even from the big global 100 companies on down. So this is very interesting when it comes to design thinking. It almost sounds just another term, but obviously it's definitely more high level in saying, hey, add diverse people, you'll have diverse thinking, more design thinking to meet your end user. And be more successful as sounds easy, but it's definitely something that I wish big corporations kind of grasp and move quicker on.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's a phenomenal point. So I'm not sure if you touched on it more, but why actually you did. So HR is the folks, because they're more their goal is to make sure they're touching their employees more. They're more forward facing with the internal employees. Is there any other department within the organization that can be tasked with bringing the design thinking, like you said, IT or something like that? Or is it just, it seems like it's easier infused by HR because these people are so people-centric focused?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think it depends how the organization is structured. So I know, and I think that's quite frankly the future. I know some companies, I think Adobe is one, have actually a role. It's called Chief Experience Officer. And both customer as well as employee experience roll up into it. And quite frankly, I think that's the future, because there's more and more overlap in the stakeholders we serve. And we need to think about experience holistically. So ideally, I think it would be in that organization. Now, I don't think that's that function exists in many organizations yet, right? So I think if you bring design thinking as a method and mindset to the entire organization, I think it almost needs to be a partnership between HR and strategy or innovation or whatever that function is, right? Because again, if you think about it both from a customer and an internal experience and merging the two together. So, but then also, of course, marketing. So marketing actually, we're lending some of the tools from marketing. So I mentioned employee experience journey mapping earlier. That actually comes from customer experience journey mapping, which marketing uses. Like employer branding comes from branding, right? So there's a connection already between those two functions. And then certainly if you want to enable it technologically, IT should be a part of it. I'm a huge fan of bringing it in cross-functional teams. And then I always say your CFO should be your BFF in HR. I know that's always controversial because we like to fight with the CFO. Yeah, exactly. I should print another T-shirt. But I've always partnered with finance because that's my other passion, is to truly quantify the value talent brings to an organization. And so it doesn't show up on the, as only a cost center on the balance sheet, right? But it's seen as a true asset to the organization, and figuring out creative ways how we can truly quantify it. So I think we should always, even though it's a hard relationship to build, I think it's an important one. So I think bringing all those stakeholders together, and then of course the business as well, the leadership. Ideally, it would be great if the CEO, to your point, would be sort of the chief design thinking officer, chief diversity officer. I think the CEO should be all of those things anyways, to walk the talk and inspire everybody else.
That's good. The CFO should be
everything.
But that's true.
That's what they're paid for, honestly. That's my right, executive pay is a whole different discussion, but I think they're paid for it and they should do that job. So
yeah, because presenting this, right, coming from HR, it may seem like it's a warm and fuzzy implementation project. And they're like, okay, but what is this going to cost? Where's the return? Where's the data to show that this is effective in organizations our size within our industry? So yes, for an HR group, it's probably best to bring other partners to the table and present it as one big package. And say, here, we covered from A to Z, from a strategy, marketing, etc., and then to get the buy-in from the person holding the purse. So that's awesome.
Yeah, and you can also, to add to that, to your point, showing the ROI, there's research actually done. I think a couple of years ago, McKinsey conducted research, and they found that organizations who use design thinking in their business operations have, higher return on investment, stronger sales, stronger revenues, and things like that. So they've actually made that correlation. So there's actually hard data there to prove design thinking as a method, as applied to business in general, has a bottom line impact. So that usually helps.
Have you found any data that shows how it impacts different generations? Because this sounds like millennials would be drawn to it because they're solving problems. Right, so they're very social focused and passionate about the future, and wanted to make sure that when they in purpose, right? So when they come to an organization, it's not just coming in, clocking in for 8 or 9 hours, but what's the purpose behind my role? How does it impact the bigger picture? Versus generation X and Y, do you see there's a higher spike per generation that's basically embracing this theory?
That's a great question. I'm not aware that there's any, because it's still fairly new for sure in HR. It's still a very emergent topic, and there isn't much research actually for specifically HR application yet. That's why I do a lot of research. But generationally, I'm not aware. But I totally agree. I think just the way of co-creation and bringing everybody in and asking everybody's opinion, if we think about tendencies and generations, that's certainly something that appeals. Being part of it, being involved, being asked, what do you think? But honestly, now that I think about it, I mean, it would be great to do some research around it to really delineate and if there are differences. But as I think now about, I've trained, I think at this point, I worked with over 1,000 professionals around design thinking. When I think about it, it really cuts across how people react to it, and that there's no generational limits to being really excited about it. Once people have experienced it, doesn't matter your generation, your whatever. I think it's more of a mindset question, and some people have a growth mindset and some people don't. And I think it resonates in general with people who have more of a growth mindset and are open to new things, experimentation, are open to change. And that cuts really across generations from what I've observed anecdotally.
Love it. Yeah, because it's very inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order for it to work, it has to be inclusive,
Mm-hmm.
which leads to my next question. And you probably answered this already again, but I may try to ask it a different way. Is what other model would partner with design thinking that works best? In my head, I'm thinking diversity and inclusion seems like a good model. Is that something that can roll under a chief diversity officer? Or like you said, does it need to be a separate chief experience officer?
Great question. Yeah. I mean, we might design the role of the future here. And I think actually
Let's
we
do it.
might. I think the concepts of, and I've thought about that actually a lot. I think there should be a future role where the concepts of experience and DEI are merged. I think there's something there. I haven't seen that a lot yet, but I think we need to design that role.
So that would
Because
look
I
like.
think,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, I think that could be a really powerful combination because, and I have my opinion, but I sometimes think we've put this one poor diversity officer, chief diversity officer in and say, hey, and you're going to solve all our diversity problems. And I think that's, we put that person up to fail. And I don't think that's fair. And we haven't really given that person the power, the tools, or the teeth, maybe to truly create a, anti-racist organization and an equitable organization. So if we combine that with something maybe, and it doesn't have to be design thinking, but something more that can give that function sort of a framework to truly design equitable workplaces, I think that could be really cool and powerful. So yeah, I think we don't have that quite yet, but I'm very excited to hopefully design that.
Yeah. So let's coin the phrase
Powerful.
together here
Yep.
live.
Yep.
Chief
Live.
Diversity Experience Officer.
Love it.
Let's
That's what we're going to do.
You heard it here first, folks.
Let's trademark that one.
Exactly.
Well,
exactly.
you should trademark it. You came up with it.
I love it. That's good because that's what it's definitely a major intersection when it comes to the future of work.
I think so.
Especially in this remote space, it's the shift to not just how do we improve our widget, but how do we improve our internal workforce and the oncoming experience for new team members and family members into an organization. This way they have value, they have purpose. And again, by result of, but I just love the term design thinking because it forces your intellect the way I heard it before was intellectual horsepower to kick in and tackle challenges that will, and then end result is improving the widget for the end user.
Yeah, and also that's another good. So it comes really also from behavioral economics, or is a method that was designed from that background because it also, and that's a great point that you're making, because what it also helps us doing is slowing down our problem solving and decision making process, and by the very nature of that, hopefully decreasing bias, because anybody who's read, Kahneman, Thinking Slow and Fast, we know as humans we have, some decision making of ours is very intuitive, but also very biased. And so by putting a method in front of our decision making, again, not for everything, because the intuitive has a purpose, a evolutionary purpose, But for especially these complex problems or these, gray or hairy, wicked problems that are people related in an organization, sometimes we really should slow down and balance our bias. That's why we do, for example, behavior-based interviewing in recruiting, right? It's also a tool that tries to help slow down. It never will totally eliminate all our biases. As we know, we're humans, we're biased, but it will help us slow down enough to let that other thinking, system thinking number 2, sort of kick in and hopefully counterbalance some of our biases to make better decisions.
I love that. I love that. So it's definitely taking on multiple challenges. Just even in your personal life, it spills over, right? So no matter where you're at, you kind of always are in that mindset of accepting of other thought processes and thinking, even in a casual conversation. So it can be done right, done with intent. It's another model that can chip away again at this bias and racism that America experience, which we definitely absolutely need. So we are coming close to the end. Man, this is definitely charged my my brain cells quite a bit to do some more research. I love behavioral economics. You mentioned a book along with that. What was the name of that book again?
Yeah, Daniel Kahneman,
Mm-hmm.
Thinking Fast and Slow, I think. Or Slow and Fast. Fast and Slow, Slow and Fast, something like that. I should know that. We teach that at Northwestern. So
Not a problem. Google will help straighten it out for me. No problem.
Yep.
Any last parting ideas, or even if you have a success story of where this is actively being done? I know you mentioned Adobe earlier. Any case studies that you can share with us?
Yeah, so I'd like to point everybody to my podcast, Talent Tales, because there you can listen to all sort of stories of organizations who have applied it to HR. I'll leave you with one example from the HR Hackathon Alliance, because so one participant, Kelly, Kelly Koshman, she's the VP of People at Cedar City. And she had actually attended a few of our HR hackathons in Chicago. And then she actually took the format and used the same format to actually a DEI challenge in her organization. And they actually invited all employees into a hackathon. And they wanted to tackle some diversity related issues that came out of their employee engagement survey. So they did the hackathons to bring in the employees to become part of creating solutions around it. And so, at the next hackathon, she came to me and she said, I want to thank you because I used the method to tackle this challenge with our employees. And, it's been, I'm a department of one in HR. So it has sort of expanded my leverage, if you will, but also employees have become more engaged because they were part of the solution. So I thought that's just one of the stories of that to me is great impact, right? Because it's helped empower HR. That's exactly what I want to do. I want to empower HR people to experiment with these methods in a safe place and then apply them in their work and to their organizations for impact. So it's a little story at the end.
Love it, love it, love it. Absolutely. So share with folks where they can connect. We popped up Talent Tales podcast. So definitely folks chime in, go ahead and download that. I'm going to do that ASAP after this to start listening to some of that stuff. But where else can they get in touch with you if they have questions, get you as a speaker? Where can they reach you?
Yeah, so LinkedIn, obviously. I'm also on Twitter. And then talent.imperative.com is my website there. And then hrhackathonalliance.com. And we're also on Twitter, Instagram now, LinkedIn. And then we have a special website for HR versus racism. So hrversusracism.org, O-R-G. And also hashtag HR versus racism.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much, Nicole, for your expertise. and sharing with us this theory, and not even theory. I'm not even going to say that it's this model of
Mhm.
design thinking. I absolutely love it. And again, let's coin that phrase: Chief Diversity Experience Officer.
And let's bring the human back to human resources. Woohoo!
Awesome. And we'll end there. Thank you, folks, for chiming in. God bless and continued success.
Bye. Take care.